This is the Life at Work Conference podcast, a production of City Bible Forum. Real workers, wrestling with real workplace issues. With your host, Life at Work National Manager, Andrew Laird.
Welcome to episode 6 of the Life at Work Conference podcast. Today, we hear from economist Professor Ian Harper, along with a Melbourne barrister, as we discuss what's the point of work. I'm Andrew Laird, and this is the Life at Work Conference podcast. Welcome again to the podcast. Real workers wrestling with real workplace issues. And today we're reflecting on what should motivate Christians in their daily work. That is, what is the purpose of work? Now, when I'm asked about the purpose of work, I often suggest that there are 5 common things many people are driven by, either consciously or more likely subconsciously. 5 reasons why people are likely to get out of bed each day and work. Firstly, there's finances. That is, I work to live. The work itself is not the end goal, but rather it's a means to an end. The money I earn allows me to do what I really want to be doing. Secondly, there is fulfillment. That is, I live to work. Other things in life might be important to me, family, friends, even faith. But where I search for my deepest fulfillment in life is through my work. This one is so common today that some suggest that meaning is the new money. We go to work to get meaning first and foremost. A third one is fame. That is making a name for yourselves. And I'll admit that this is what drove me in much of my work background as a journalist. We weren't in it for the terrible shift work hours or the money, which was fairly meagre. Rather, we were in it for the fame. Being recognised on the TV, known on the radio, and so on. Of course, this is relevant to every field of work. We can aspire to be known as the best, the most competent, the most impressive in our industry. A fourth motivation can be family. We pursue a certain job, a certain qualification because of how it will reflect for good upon our family. Or on the flip side, we put pressure on our children to get certain jobs so it reflects well on us. So finances, fulfillment, fame, family, and fifth and finally, force. Well, that is power or control. The longer that we're in a profession, the less happy we might be with just settling for middle management. So we work harder and longer to climb the ladder and get into greater positions of power and control. Now, I think those are 5 common motivations for why many people work. But you know what's common to them all as I've described them? They all have an inward orientation. That is, they're all about what can I gain out of work for me. Now, the Christian vision for why we work is, of course, radically different to this. Instead of being an inward, selfish, what can I get out of work for me, our purpose should be an outward, selfless, what can I give through my work to others? That is the purpose of work for Christians. It is to love. Now, to give a practical example of what this looks like, let's dig back into the archives and check out this short clip of Economist and Reserve Bank board member Professor Ian Harper. Professor Harper was being interviewed at our 2020 Life at Work conference, and he explained how love for God and love for neighbour shapes his daily work.
I find that it's quite straightforward. After all, as any Christian would do, your first commandment is to love the Lord God with all your heart, mind, soul and strength. Okay, that's common to all of us. The second then is to love your neighbour as yourself. And an economist seeks to love his or her neighbour like him or herself by advising governments in particular about policies that can help to improve the material circumstances of the community, to alleviate poverty, to alleviate disadvantage, to help people to be free of material constraints that bind them. The Lord Jesus is pretty strict about poverty being a bad thing. Right? And of course, he doesn't say that wealth is necessarily all that life is about, on the contrary. But neither does he pick on people particularly and say, you know what, you're a wealthy person, you should give all that away. In some circumstances, yes, he does, because he knows that the person is worshipping that. But wealth in and of itself is not a bad thing. So loving your neighbour by helping governments to behave more responsibly and to deliver basic services that people need, like health and education, welfare services. Those systems, the design of them, the way they're administered, there's a lot of economics that goes into running those systems more or less efficiently. People would be concerned about the environment. We need to be, as Christians, stewards of the environment. Well, economics has a lot to say about how you can interact with the resources of the earth more or less efficiently.
Professor Ian Harper there explaining how love motivates him and shapes his work as an economist. Now, in a moment, I'll be joined by barrister Ray Ternes, and we're going to explore the same question with him, just considering how love shapes his work in a different profession, namely the legal profession.
Looking for a great podcast to share with your colleagues? Look no further than City Bible Forum's Bigger Questions, a weekly podcast with a different guest each time, exploring the big questions of life and the impact Christianity has had on their life for good. Subscribe today wherever you get your podcasts, or find out more at citybibleforum.org/biggerquestions.
Well, welcome back. I'm joined now by Melbourne barrister Ray Ternes. Ray works primarily in personal injury law, but also appears regularly in administrative law, employment law and commercial law matters. So welcome to the podcast, Ray.
Thanks, Andrew.
Now, Ray, first of all, just share a little bit about how you ended up working in the legal profession. What led you down that particular career path?
Well, it's a little bit funny because I never had any kind of desire to be a lawyer. So I did arts and law at uni, arts because I was interested in politics and Indonesian, so they were my majors. And I tacked law on the side because I thought, well, arts alone isn't going to get me a job. And then once I'd sort of been through a few years of uni, I thought, well, I might as well do articles and become a lawyer. And I did that and started working and found I quite enjoyed it. So I sort of fell into it in a way. And then it wasn't till I sort of worked at a firm for a few years and then went in-house for a few years. And then it was only after I'd been working in the law for kind of 5 or 6 years that I discovered I wanted to work as a barrister and headed down that path.
Fantastic. I mean, I ask you that question because it's obviously interesting to hear people's story of how they ended up where they are, but also because in this episode we're reflecting on the things which drive us in our daily work, what motivates us to go and do our work and end up in the professions that we do. The purpose of our work, if you like. And we're going to come to that motivation of love for the Christian person in just a moment that we explored a bit earlier in the podcast. But before we do, I mentioned those other selfish motivations at the beginning, things like finances, fulfillment, fame, family, force. Tell me, do you find yourself most tempted by any of those in particular, and how do you handle those temptations when they arise?
Well, I think really at different times and to different degrees, I'm tempted by all of those. So as a barrister, I'm self-employed, and it means quite literally my time is my money. And if you're in the happy situation of having enough work available to you, you can just work longer and longer hours and earn more and more money. So I am tempted by finances, the first of your F's, at times. I think probably at the moment, the most tempting for me is this idea of fame that you described. And, being a barrister, you're self-employed, you need to get work from solicitors. To a certain extent, you need a reputation, or what you might call a brand these days. And so you need some fame. So that is a particular temptation because to a certain degree, you rely on it. So your question was, how do I handle that? Well, I think it's to do with broad interests, spending time in my church community, and this might sound a bit funny, but sometimes doing really mundane things. So spending time mowing the grass around the home, or the church grounds. At the start of last year, my wife decided we were going to get chickens, so of course we did. Built a chook house, which is probably the worst looking chook house in Melbourne, and I once a week clean out the chicken poo. Now, if there's any way to sort of keep your fame in check, then it's cleaning out chicken poo. I mean, it's a pretty mundane sort of activity, but yeah, all these things, spending time with God and His Word. An egotistical Christian. I mean, that's just oxymoronic. So, all these things, these kind of broad interests, help me keep that temptation in check, I think.
Sounds good. So if anyone's listening to this podcast and they're wrestling with fame at the moment, we can send them round to your place to help clean out the chicken coop.
Please do. Volunteers are welcome, I tell you what.
Helps bring you down a peg. Well, look, Ray...
We'll call it the humility activity.
Yes, that's right. Look, Ray, lawyers sometimes get an unfair rap, putting their ethics aside for the sake of a win and so on. But tell me, just from a Christian perspective, how do you see the law and the legal profession as a good, even God-given part of our society?
Yeah, I see it as an essential part, but more than an essential part, a good part, a healthy part. In the same way that I look at teachers or doctors or nurses or any of these kind of serving professions. I've been blessed to spend a little bit of time living overseas, not a lot of time, but a little bit of time. And I think when you compare the Australian legal system to some other legal systems you see in the world, which are blighted by corruption to a large degree, not that we're free of that, but, to some degree, the law and the legal profession is a really good thing. It's an important thing to be functioning well for our society. For a flourishing society, you need a healthy legal system.
So it's a good for a flourishing society. Just taking that the next step further for you as a Christian person, how does that then shape how you think about your work as an opportunity to love others? In other words, how can the command "love thy neighbour" shape the work of a barrister?
Well, about service, I think. So it's kind of stating the obvious to say that as a barrister, I work for my clients and I try and do the best I can for them in any particular case where I'm acting for them. But I also, as I understand Jesus' teaching on neighbour, it's broader than just that, and it's all the people I come into contact with. So it's my opponents, it's the witness that I'm cross-examining. And so loving my neighbour in that situation might mean that instead of cross-examining in a really rude, obnoxious sort of way, I'm actually careful and respectful and courteous. And I mean, the funny thing about that is that you often get a better result from your client when you're being courteous than when you're being a bit of an arse. There's some examples of how I try and love my neighbour as a barrister. More recently in my career, I've been doing a lot of work for people who, when they were children, were abused when they're in the care of various institutions, whether governmental or religious. And I'm acting for the now adults, but then children. And that work, it's really easy to see how my work is loving my neighbour and contributing to the greater good. Earlier in my career, I did a lot of work for insurance companies, and they're the sort of ones that get a bad rap. You referred to it as unfair rap, which was good of you, I think. But, they're the kind of lawyers that get a bad rap in, film and literature and that sort of stuff. And I think even in that situation, you're still loving your neighbour, you're still fulfilling an important role in the legal system as a small cog in a big wheel, helping to serve others, helping to bring about an appropriate outcome for whatever particular claim you're dealing with. So all of that is loving your neighbour, working to the best of your ability as a lawyer, or in my case, a barrister.
I love the way you think broadly in terms of neighbour there, and how that then overflows into not just the way that you're seeking to serve your clients, but everyone that you encounter. And as you say, it can sometimes lead to actually a better outcome and better result. Which leads me to my next question in some ways, that some might think, if I put the interest of others before my own in my profession, I'm going to get left behind. Has that been something that you have feared, and how do you address that?
Yeah, it has been something I feared, and maybe a little bit more when I was early on in my time at the bar. I'm now 7 years in, and fortunately I've got plenty of work coming in, which is great. But I was given some advice by my mentor when I was early on, who's a wonderful Catholic woman, and she said, we've each got to just run our own race as a barrister. Don't compare yourself to others. Don't worry about the fantastic briefs in the High Court that others in your cohort are getting. Just build your own practice and worry about that. And that was really helpful, and I think that helped me not try and kind of, push my way to the front of the crowd or kind of stand on others. So, a couple of years ago, there was a room coming up, some chambers that were available. And the way it works with your chambers, which is just your office, we call it chambers because we like to be fancy, and a bigger room became available, and there were two of us who applied for it. And I knew the other guy, I was friends with him. I was a bit more senior, so I was entitled to the room. I decided, I won't take the chambers, I'll give him a chance. And I think that was one of the times that I was, my better angels were on top of my demons in that instance. And I was listening to my mentor, I think, in that example. But, like you were saying before, or you picked up on before, you kind of, in a funny way, it's a better business practice or a better business model to not be a self-promoting, sort of egotistical kind of person. You endear yourself to others much more if you're not blowing your own trumpet all the time and trying to jump on top of others to get to the top of the pile.
Look, just one final question. You've spoken about loving your neighbour in terms of the people around you, the people you're serving, the people that you're cross-examining in your particular field. But you mentioned earlier on how you see law as a good and as an essential thing for the flourishing of our society. Maybe can you unpack that a little bit more in terms of loving neighbour? I mean, how do you see those things coming together, seeking to uphold law well in a way that for the betterment of others and the betterment of society?
Well, fundamentally, law is about the civil law is about sorting out disputes between individuals or companies or both. And you need a fair, just and reliable legal system to have all those things happening. And when people are loving their neighbour, when they're serving others rather than putting themselves first, that system works at its best because the people trust each other and things get done efficiently. So your legal system is at its best when people are not self-serving, but they're interested in serving their clients, in being honest and upfront with the court, when they're not making stupid arguments or points, but focusing on the real issues in dispute. It all works together for a better legal system, for what I described earlier as a more flourishing society. So the love your neighbour is really, I think, fundamental, and it acts for a better legal system when people are aspiring to that norm, if not upholding it.
Look, Ray, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate you joining us and just helping us ground this idea of loving our neighbour in the workplace in a really practical way, obviously in your context in the area of law. So thank you so much, Ray.
Pleasure. Good to speak with you.
Well, look, that brings us to the end of episode 6 of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. In our next episode, we're going to be thinking D&I, diversity and inclusion in the workplace. For some Christians, such policies are considered a threat, but join us as we explore the tremendous opportunity they can provide for us to put the Christian faith on centre stage in the workplace. We're going to hear from one woman who did just that in one of Australia's largest banks, plus reflections from Australian blogger and author Steve McAlpine. But until next time, I'm Andrew Laird, and you've been listening to the Life at Work Conference podcast.
The Life at Work Conference podcast is produced by City Bible Forum. To find out more and register for the conference, go to citybibleforum.org/lifeatworkconference.